Welcome to the 6-part mini tutorial series where I take you through the process of creating a stylized game asset. The series assumes that you have an understanding of Maya and you have an understanding of Substance Painter. If you would like to learn more about 3D, or if you would like to learn more about the softwares, check out our courses on Udemy. You can find a link for that down in the description. In this section of the tutorial series, we're going to take a look at the basics of Substance Painter, and we're going to start laying down our base colors for our stylized asset. We're also going to take a look at how we can use some of our baked maps to help us in creating the base texture, and we'll create a low level of a stylized asset that could be considered complete. Okay, so let's go ahead and start the texturing process here. The first thing I want to do is I want to talk a bit about the smart materials that we have inside of Substance Painter here and how we could use this to create something either stylized or realistic very quickly. Now, if you are a Substance Painter user, you are a pro, this is going to be like, duh. But for those of you who have never seen this, this is going to be a magical moment because Substance Painter is a very powerful tool. You have two tabs here. You have basic materials, and here you have smart materials. Now, what's the difference between a smart material and a basic material? A smart material went to school. No, I'm just kidding. The difference between the two is that the smart material is linked up to various gradients and ramps and generators that utilize the bake information that we just created to guide various aspects such as wear and tear and grunge and details. The base materials are just basic materials that you can use as a base building block. So the smart materials already have some things done for you, and the basic materials are a clean slate to begin with. Now, if I come in here, we can also search, and I could search for something like wood at the top, and we can see all the different wood here. You'll see I have a couple more woods than you might be used to. Those are because they are woods I used on other projects or I created for things, but there's a handful of ones in here that we could just use. So for example, we could look at something like this wooden ship Nordic hull, and I could drag and drop this onto here, and this is going to give us a nice looking wood texture here to begin with. Not really what I'm looking for. I probably want something a little bit more stylized, so I'm not going to use this. But you can see why I was emphasizing the importance of wood grain direction. With this, we can just drag and drop this onto here, and you'll see the wood grains running along the board correctly here, and it's also doing the same along the top. These ones, not so great looking. I might want to change this up. If you guys hear weird noises in the background, it's my kids, so feel free to ignore it. But you'll see, those are just running along there. So good enough. But you might also be thinking, hey, that's great, but what about the metal? Now, that's where that ID map came in. We can come over here and we can right-click on this layer. This layer is what contains the smart material. You can see dust, pattern, roughness. We can actually dial these back to what we want, which is kind of cool. So, for example, I might find something like that to be better as a stylized wood, but I'm going to leave everything because I'm going to delete this anyway. But those are all the components of the smart material. But to use that ID map, we can right-click on here, and we can go ahead and come in here to add mask with color selection. If you go ahead and do that, you'll get this nice little doohickey here that allows us to pick a color to decide what is masked and what is not. So down here, this is going to be the area we're going to do this in. We can use pick color here, and we can pick the color we want it to mask by. So I can just pick red, and now you'll see it is only affecting the wood. However, you might notice it's on our metal a little bit. So what can we do about that? You can use the tolerance slider here to adjust what area is considered wood and not. And you can also use the hardness slider here to decide how soft or hard something should be in terms of this. Now, you can't always get it to be completely perfect, but once you start to blend the two materials, it's not going to matter too much. So I'm just going to set the tolerance to 1 there, and probably set the hardness to 1 as well, so that way we get that base there. Now we can go ahead and do the metals. Just like we did before with the wood, we could look for something like metal here, and you could pick whatever metal looks right for what you're going for. In this particular instance, it depends on the amount of wear and tear we want. I could grab something like the steel scratched or steel ruined or steel rusted here. Just drag and drop that onto there, see if it's fit. Not really. And I could just go through these, and I'm just hitting Control-Z to undo, and we could just kind of pick one of these we like or one of these we don't like and go with it. So something like this looks pretty close to like a new barrel. I could just right-click here, and we could go ahead and do a add mask with color selection, and we can go and pick this. And there you go, a semi-realistic looking barrel to slap into your game. Now, you could stop here. I don't advise it. This is very base level. This is also not stylized. This isn't what we were aiming for. So what we're going to do now is explore using Substance here properly to build out our material. But I wanted to go through the basics here with you just so you can see how quickly you can use these, especially with an ID map, to kick something out. So if you are just trying to make a low-end game, you're trying to crank things out as quickly as possible, it can really be as simple as dragging and dropping these materials. And when you get into some custom ones, like if I look at some of the ones I built for things, like, I guess none of these are really that special, but something like this mansion material. This is a nice wooden mansion map. You can see, you can drag and drop it and have your own custom material, which can be kind of nice. Now, that's a terrible example, so I'm just going to delete that. But that's the base idea. So let's go ahead and start over from scratch, kind of building out a texture. I think I'm going to do something between these two. I kind of like the style of this one, and I might sample the color from something else. We'll see, and just see what we can achieve. So let's get started with that. First step is delete what we already have. You can come over here into the woods here and see if they have a nice base wood to work from. It really depends on what you want to go with. I don't think any of these are going to be what we want. There is a stylized wood here. So we could actually use this to get our base, which is interesting. I don't really like the pock marks there, but we could play around with something like the roughness here, and we could play around with the fiber amount. This is actually a newer one to Substance. They've started adding these stylized tools because they were really focused on realistic before. I don't know if I can get rid of those indents though, which might be a break point for me. But we could, use this as a base if we wanted to. So just kind of be aware they do have stylized stuff now too. But let's just go from the ground up. How would I start this? I'd come over here and I'd create something called a fill layer. This here is a fill layer. A fill layer is just a solid color. I can then specify the base color using an eyedropper here and picking from my other screen. So I could pick a base barrel color. I could also pick directly from the reference I'm working on if there is, a style I want to kind of pull from. And I actually do like that one. I feel like this one is pretty appealing. So I'm just going to go with that. And we can make this our wood base. Now, there are a couple other channels we can control and decide if we want to have this. Metalness will make it metal or not. So for wood, we're not going to want it to be metal. Roughness here can allow us to set the base roughness. If you take a look at barrels, they are pretty rough at the end of the day. Newer ones are maybe a little bit shinier, but yeah, they're pretty rough. And it depends on if the pipeline we're going into even uses roughness. If we're doing stylized, sometimes they don't. Normal, we can just leave it there. Flat, height, we can leave it there, flat. Then what I'm going to do is hit Control G. I'm going to put this into a folder, and we're just going to make this our wood. And then right-click. We can come down to our Add Mask with Color selection, select our color, and there we go. Now we have that selected. We can then adjust our tolerance here and play around with our hardness. So and make sure that's maxed out. And that actually already looks pretty stylized in itself. Now, the next one is our metal. I'm just going to create a base for this one, and we'll just make this our metal base. We can then use our color picker here, and we can grab the metallic color we might want to work from. And depending on the style you're working in, you may want to make this more or less stylized. If you want to go full metalness, you can crank the metalness up there. And we can also adjust the roughness there to be nice and soft. And there we go. I can then hit Control G. We can go ahead and make this our metal. We can right click, add mask with color selection, and we can pick our metal. So we'll get a nice stylized look there. Now from here, we need to determine how we want to approach this. There's a number of ways we can do this. One way I like to approach it is to just start by using some of our baked maps. One of the things that is very characteristic of stylized art is to have edges that have highlights on them. And we can actually see that here on the crack highlights. You can see how the cracks have a lighter area, the indents have a darker area, and you probably see something similar here. You can see that light color there, dark color there. That's a shading technique that simulates light catching on the edges of things, and it looks very appealing. It's also something you do see in real life. You'll see how this spot right here is lighter than right next to it. So it is actually something out of the real world. So how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to create a fill layer on top of everything here. I'm going to double click this and I'm going to make this our edge, or we can name it curvature rather. That'd be a better name. We can turn off everything but color. And the way you just turn them off is by clicking these dials here. We can navigate now over into our texture map section, which is going to be this dial here that says textures. And we can look for curve. And we already baked out our curvature. This is where our maps live that we baked out. So if I go ahead and grab curvature here, I can bring this into the base. And you'll see there it is living on top of this. And we can bring this on top with something like an overlay. So if I just come in here and overlay, you'll see that it's going to darken the darks, it's going to lighten the lights. And if I go ahead and set this to base color, which removes the shading, you can see the flat lit form of that. So you can see how we're getting that nice light area there on the metal, nice dark area there on the cracks and crevices. Now, there are some issues with this though, and that's that the default overlay mathematics don't make this transparent, meaning it darkens the whole thing. So what I like to do is I like to add a mask to this. I just right click and add a black mask. Then I paint a little dot on this mask to let me see the area that it is affecting. Then clicking onto the actual color image here, not the mask, you can right click and you can add levels. And this will create a histogram just like you have in something like Photoshop. And you can use this middle dial here to dial in the gamma here, the gray area, lightness and darkness. So I'm going to pull that down until the darkness disappears. And now you'll see we're just getting the highlights. And if I switch this to base color, you'll see how we're just getting the light and dark there. And then what I do after that is delete the mask. I just come to the mask, right click, and we go ahead and delete it. So we can remove mask. And now you'll see we're getting this, but it's not affecting our color. All right, so that's just using a quick adjustment of levels, and that's going to give us a base curvature there. Now, at this point, I can decide if I want to dial this up or down. I'm actually really liking this at the maximum height, so I'm going to leave that be. Now, depending on what kind of pipeline you're in, you can also bring in additional things like ambient occlusion. Ambient occlusion isn't as common if you're working with a higher end, renderer. Like, let's say you're going into something like a desktop game, or you're going to go to a console game. You wouldn't necessarily bake ambient occlusion because you have the budget to actually apply ambient occlusion in game, or you could actually apply the ambient occlusion map as a map inside of Engine. So there is an input there in shaders. But let's say you're in a lower end environment, like you're working in mobile or you're working in VR or augmented reality. A lot of the times you are not going to get to use ambient occlusion in your engine. And you're also not necessarily going to be able to use real-time lighting. The last position I was at, I was working in mobile augmented reality, and at the lowest lighting tier inside of our levels, the lowest settings, we were only allowed one real-time light, which was the default directional light in Engine, and we had to use lighting probes for everything else. So all the lighting had to be faked. When you're in that scenario, you're going to add a fill layer. You can name this AO, and just like we did before, turn off everything but color. And in here, in our textures, you can just type amb for ambient occlusion. Find the ambient occlusion and just slap that into the base color and then bring this on top as a multiply. Now, this one is very aggressive, so be careful. I like to look at this in the base color mode. This is the unlit, and then I dial it down from here. Usually I find somewhere around 30 to 50 to be appropriate, depending on the style. With something more stylized, I might go a bit heavier here, but you can see how that's going to give us some nice undershading on top of everything else we have here. And also there's a little bit of shading interaction here between the metal and the wood. And if I toggle that, you can see that. It also gives a nice sloped look to the metal there. Okay. Now I'm also going to bring that under the curvature because I actually want the light to go over the top of that. But that's going to get us some of the nice little bake tools we have to give us a bit more detail. So I'm going to save this now. And we can continue our exploration with some of these baked maps. it's always good to see what you can get out of your bake maps. You don't always know. There's world space normals that can be useful. Thickness can be useful sometimes. The normal map can even be useful sometimes as color. And same with things like the position. It just depends, and really depends. Now, to give you an example, when I was working on the Kindred Fates game, I did some character art for them. I would actually use the world space normal map to fake some shading, because they have a interesting shader they're using for the style of their game. And I found that utilizing the world space normal input actually did a really good job adding some extra detail. In most cases, this is not good, and I will show you why. It actually might work okay on this one, which is kind of weird. But just to kind of show you how you can do this, we can search for world space normal, pipe this into base color, and you're probably thinking, wow, you're totally insane. That thing looks like the Incredible Hulk, and you are correct. But there's a trick we can do to this, which is to use a gradient on it. Now, if you're not familiar with gradient maps, what they do is they take values and they map a new color to it. And you'll see this is probably one of the weirdest areas here, but I think because our UV cut is aligned exactly with one of these lines, we actually don't have anything weird here. So I could right click this here. And if we come down here to filter are going to be the various filters you can use that are going to have a wide range of effects. These are similar to adjustment filters in Photoshop, if you're familiar with that, but there's also other things you can see here like blurs, which is also, I guess, technically a filter, but not an adjustment layer, right? So inside of here, if we just type in something like gradient, you'll see there's a few different types we can grab here. I always get these wrong, so we'll see if I get the right one here. I think it's just default gradient. What this will do is it will convert this to a grayscale. And if I go ahead and use base color here, you can see what this is doing. Now, world space normals essentially maps the normal direction to world space. So every one of these has a different direction. And you can see this actually creates sort of a natural looking light bake. This is not ideal for all pipelines, so I want to emphasize that. But this is one of those ways you can actually trick form into your object if you are using a flat lit scenario. Now, if you guys aren't familiar with flat lighting, that means using no lighting at all, and that's what we're doing here. Now, this can also work with a lit scenario, depending on what kind of style you're using. Now, I'm just going to come over here to normal and set this to something like overlay, and you can see the effect this has. And this is with the lighting on. This is with the lighting off. You can see how it has this three-dimensional form, and it actually looks lit and shaded. You can then dial this up or down using this to decide how much form you want to get out of this, but that's a nice little trick you can use. Now, I just wanted to show that. I'm not actually going to use that on this one, but it is a neat trick. I'm going to delete that layer and just come back here. Just for the sake of things, let's go to thickness. You can see that you can also slap thickness on here, and that will give you an equally different looking approach. And this might actually be a good approach depending on what you're trying to achieve. If I wanted to get the edges to look lighter, for example, you could actually run something like an invert on this. So I could right click, add filter, come down here to filter. And if you look for invert, you'll see you can invert that. I could then take this and do an overlay with it, or even just something like a multiply or a screen, depending on my ultimate goal, and use that as a base to just kind of push those whites a little bit more. In this case, multiply might be kind of interesting to darken the center areas. I could bring this down under the wood layer, so it only affects the wood. And now you can see, utilizing that, we can dial that up and down. I could also set it to something like an overlay and levels to it, and use the gamma here to adjust this, or even come in and use the black point here to push this so that we're just getting broader, soft edges around the white area. And you can see the effect that has on our asset. And I actually kind of like that. That makes those pop a bit more. I can dial this up or down here, and you can see how that thickness comes in handy, and I can just make this our thickness. So like I mentioned, you don't always want thickness, but sometimes it actually comes in handy to do really weird things like this, where it's like, well, now I have this massive level of control over these, side corners, where I can really come in here and add wear and tear, make them pop against the contrast of the center point, So yeah, then, that's a win. Now I could also see what this looks like on the metal now. In general, not great, because you can see thickness is going to account for the actual geometry. So not good there, but hey, we get one win. We take the wins, okay? So that's going to be using some of our just base generated textures to get a nice look to this. At this stage, once again, depending on the style of your game, this could be good. You could stop here. But we're going to take this a little bit further. We're going to take a look at how we might be able to add some detail, just kind of building things up with layers in here, and see where we can take this in terms of stylization. I might also get to some hand painting, we'll see, but that's going to be the process of adding in some of our baked layers into here to build up some form. Thank you for watching this tutorial series. Be sure to like and subscribe for future content.